So I'm going to talk about something slightly different from what has been talked about so far today. I'm going to talk about food, and in particular biotech foods. I will explain in a minute what I mean by biotech foods. And I will also talk about how citizens in the European Union and in the US can participate within the food system and the decision-making process for such foods. So first of all, what do I mean by novel food technologies? Well, the usual one is, biotech foods, so GM coming from plants, but we also have GM foods coming from animals. Some of you might know that at the end of last year, the US has approved the first genetically engineered fish, which is a salmon, to be put on the market over the next few years. So this is also a source of concern. Another one which you might be familiar with is, and you can see a picture of Dolly the sheep behind me, it's animal cloning and it's used in farming. Another one which you might not have heard of is in vitro cultured meat, in terms of, this synthetic meat that you can have and which was developed in the Netherlands by a professor. So when I talk about novel food technology, I mean these types of biotech foods. Now, when we look at the food and the agricultural systems that we have in the world, so not only in the EU and the US, but what we have is a system which is being controlled by a few big multinational corporations. And when we think about, biotech, well, the first one that was mentioned a lot today is Monsanto, of course, Syngenta. When we think about animal cloning, it's Vigen. And when we think about genetically engineered animals, then it's Aqua Bounty. What these companies do is that they control the food system. And they use this as a vehicle of control, but also in terms of using food as a weapon. Using food as a weapon was actually developed or pushed forward by the US in the 1970s. And then food becomes a weapon in terms of trying to produce food cheaply to the entire world, which the US has managed to do. Also, what these big companies do in terms of controlling the food system and the agricultural system is that they choose what we eat. We might think that we choose what we eat, but we don't. Actually, corporations choose or they choice edit what is available in the supermarkets, what we all buy on a daily basis. And they choose also the information that is being given to us. And for me, when we look at the agricultural system that we have today, there is something wrong with it. And of course, when you think about alternatives to it, there are a lot of alternatives around. So for instance, the slow food movement, the concept of food sovereignty. But the one that interests me the most, because it also talks about sustainable agriculture and another type of farming, is the concept of food democracy. Food democracy is aiming at decentralizing the control which these big multinational corporations have. This concept of food democracy was developed by a British farmer who is also an academic. He's called Tim Lang and he works at City University in London. For him, when you look at food democracy, when you look at the two terms separately, it doesn't mean very much, but when you put them together, it creates something different, something which aims for people to actually participate in the food system and for farmers to actually be able to impact on the food system. So rather than being told what to do, they do what they want. The aim of that is to have more decency and more social justice within the food system. To that extent, having wages for farmers and them not losing out, having good working conditions for on-farm staff, and this is key. Having something else. Now, more specifically, what do I mean? Food democracy is about actively engaging with the food that we eat. But not only us as consumers, or as I prefer to call us, citizens, because consumers is something, again, that big corporations like to use, but it's about us being empowered to actually influence the food and the agricultural systems. By us, I mean everyone. And that includes farmers, that includes us here in this room, but it's also all stakeholders. And this is key. And the aim of that is to have a more sustainable and just society. The aim is to transform the food supply chain, and with that in mind, to turn passive consumers into active citizens. And for us, for everyone, to realize that, well, we only have one Earth and we should look after it. Now, of course, this is an ideal. Okay, I'm not, I know this won't be done overnight, but there are various developments in relation to biotech foods in both the EU and the US, and this is what I'm going to talk about next. This idea that instead of having a top-down approach, we can go bottom-up. We can choose what we want to eat. And within the EU, when we think about biotech foods or novel food technologies, there has been various developments in favor of food democracy, in favor of different ways to approach the food system. And some of them, of course, deal with now having pre-market authorization for cloned food, for in vitro meat, which will be good from 2018 with the 2015 Novel Foods Regulation that was passed last year. And also, and very importantly, member states within the EU being able to decide whether they can cultivate or not GM crops onto their lands. So in that way, the EU has decided to give more power to the national systems and individual states. Currently, 19 out of the 28 member states have decided to go GM-free, so to cultivate no GM on their land, which is, of course, a big issue in the EU, because how is that going to work when you have states next to each other? Now, something that is more of relevance to my talk and focusing on food, it's how a proposal to do the same thing for GM foods, i.e. for member states to actually say no and prohibit GM foods on their territory, has actually been rejected by the members of parliament. Now, the reason for that was that trade barriers couldn't be destroyed within the EU. Now, I don't see where that comes from. It's an argument that doesn't work because it's the same issue for GM crop cultivation. There is an issue of trade there, but the issue of trade wasn't considered as important, okay? Now, some people will argue that crop is easier to monitor, which of course is the case, but crop is much more invasive than food, and therefore this is also the other argument. So this is the situation in the EU. There are some initiatives to help us decide where our food comes from, but of course it's not ideal. In the US, and to a certain extent, it's the same. There has been some very important developments recently, and some of you might know that from the 1st of July 2016, Vermont has decided that all GM foods had to be labeled, which meant that every food coming into Vermont had to be labeled as GM, because in the US, food and all types of food are virtually contain GM ingredients. That meant that since the 1st of July, well, everything had to be labeled as containing GM. Of course, big companies, i.e. Monsanto, were not really happy, and the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which lead in the US, wasn't happy as well. This has been that has fallen under the radar, actually, is this new bill that was actually signed by Obama in August. And this bill, 764, actually will allow manufacturers to disclose that their food contains GM. Okay, that would be great. It means that GM food will be labeled, right? When you look at it, it seems amazing. There will be some kind of GM label or something else, and every food will be labeled as GM. Now, what this bill says is that companies have three choices. The first one is a statement saying this contains GM food. The second one is a symbol on the packaging. And the last one creates much controversy because the last one is a QR code, which meant that we would all have to go with our mobile phones and scan every single food that we want to eat to make sure that it contains or not GM. Of course, there are exclusions in relation to this labeling, and those exclusions are very similar to what we have in the EU. So animals fed with GM feed wouldn't be labeled. Food that comes from GM wouldn't be labeled either. Okay? So there are some exclusions. Now, once I've said that, I'm just going to contradict myself because that specific bill does. Actually, what the bill allows to do is for manufacturers to create a single national standard, and that standard will have to be created by 2018. But that standard can be created in the sense that it will not require GM to be labeled at all. And the Food and Drug Administration in the US has clearly said that very few foods in the US will have to be labeled following that specific bill. Another problem with this bill is that it creates discrimination towards poorer people because they might not have access to internet, they might not have mobile phones, and it also discriminates again elderly people who might not have smartphone, who might not have, the possibility to do that. I mean, if every single manufacturer chooses to go down the QR code route, this means that there will not be a very easy label on there. So overall, and I'm going to finish on a negative note here, is that of course there are some initiatives that help us heading towards a different food system and a different agricultural food system. But these big manufacturer, these big corporations prevent us from doing that. But I think it's not a reason why we should stop trying to be more active and have and implement strong regulation that will help us choose the food that we want. Thank you very much.